All right, welcome everybody for this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. I'm very, very happy that we are being joined by, well, I think everybody here to varying degrees has watched at least a couple of episodes of Breaking History on Badlands Media. I was very, at first, when I discovered that my former co-host, Sean Morgan, had to go and take on a new project and leave me hanging a little bit, I was a bit nervous, thinking, okay, well, who could possibly fill that void? And Gordon reached out saying, "Hey, I wouldn't mind doing it." So we're like, "Okay, let's give it a shot. Let's see how our chemistry works." And after the first episode, I knew, bam, that's it. I've had the most fun. I've learned the most, more than any other co-host or any other interviewing dialogue partner I've ever had as far as one of these shows are concerned. Gordon has topped the cake. I'm super impressed. And again, I'm always learning a lot every time we do a weekly show on Badlands Media. And Gordon was gracious enough to share some insights, some work that he's been doing that touches on current events, especially in the Middle East, which has become increasingly major focus of expertise that Gordon has been able to bring to the table, is with a deep sensitivity to the intelligence operations throughout history that have shaped and misshaped and malformed a region of great potential, which feasibly, if the world continues to play their cards right, could recapture the ancient positive Renaissance heritage of Persia, of the great ancient cultures that have produced so much beauty and goodness and discoveries in the arts and medicine and astronomy and architecture as a bridge between East and West. So, Gordon, thank you so much for doing this. And like usual, we're gonna, after Gordon's main presentation is over, we're gonna open up for Q&A for people who want me to read your question. Just write it very concisely and in a short form in the chat box. If you want to ask the question, put your name up like usual, or put your little digital hand up, and we'll call upon you. So it's all yours, Gordon.
Great. Well, thank you again for having me, Matt. So yeah, what I've been focusing on, like where my interest has been obviously the Arabian Peninsula. That's been a lot of my focus over the past a year and a half. Although I've taken a really strong interest in Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince, and really been tracking him since he came on the scene globally in 2017. I've been really interested to hear and see what he says and does, especially because he has there's so much sparse information on his background, and very encouraged by what he's doing. Because I think ultimately, for a very long time, I think a lot of people in the West have been hoping and praying for somebody to, like a strong leader, to come along in the Middle East who could actually reform the problems that are occurring over there, much of which has been started and exacerbated by, as Matt pointed out, the Western intelligence agencies. And the more and more we've dug into this, and I've dug into this, the more I've just found that to be the case. So it's really encouraging to see what's happening right now over there, or what's been happening. And I'm actually not at all really deterred or discouraged by the recent developments, because I do think that ultimately this is going to come to fruition, and that we're going to get a stabilized Middle East. We're going to get the true end of radical Islamic terrorism, and hopefully the exposure of the nefarious activities of the Western intelligence agencies, British intelligence, CIA, even Mossad, and their involvement in the proxy militias over there. So where I'd like to start is, with 1979, the title of this discussion. And as I was explaining to Matt before y'all jumped on, I didn't know what to call it. I was thinking about calling it like 1979, the turning point, 1979, the fulcrum year, the radicalization of Persia. And I felt like that radicalization is a word that's been used ad nauseum, I feel like, and it's overused. So I went with polarization. So in 1979, prior to, let's back up a little bit. Matt and I have covered before. We've covered the involvement that the British had in World War I in recruiting the Hashemites, who were on the western coast of Arabia, along the Red Sea, and getting them to fight the Ottoman Empire in exchange for their sovereignty, their own nation at the end of the war. They succeeded in defeating the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, were betrayed by the British and the French and the Americans, really, and not necessarily given their own country. They weren't given their own sovereignty, and the Hashemites, who were the good actors, the altruistic actors in that conflict, ended up being really slaughtered over the next few decades, systematically destroyed and removed. And they're not really rival, but just another contender. The House of Saud, who was also being propped up in the east by the British, were used to defeat the Hashemite kingdom in the west, and then Saudi Arabia became Saudi Arabia as opposed to Hashemite Arabia or something to that effect. So what after World War One, what you really saw is you really saw the consolidation of power in the region. You saw there was a lot of individual actors from the Hashemites as well as other factions who were trying in earnest to establish sovereignty and their own autonomy for their people. And those people, of course, were systematically removed, and color revolutions were implemented. You saw socialism introduced to, or I guess you really would say Bolshevism was introduced. And in the 1950s, you had a series of revolutions across the region, namely in Iran, 1953, and in 1958 in Iraq, you had Iraq and Jordan, which were the last two real Hashemite kingdoms, cousins, descendants of the Hashemites from Western Arabia, and they were trying to form a almost like a new kingdom. They were trying to not necessarily combine Jordan and Iraq into one country, but they were trying to form a Hashemite kingdom. They signed paperwork that stipulated that, and of course, then we had a color revolution in Iraq, like a Bolshevik style color revolution. The ruling family was walked out into the courtyard of their palace, and all of them were executed, including the women and children. The king and the crown prince were brutally desecrated, like brutally massacred, and then their bodies put on display. And then who ultimately came to power after that and filled the void was the Ba'ath Party, and eventually 10 years later that would be Saddam Hussein. I think it was 10 or 20 years later you had Saddam Hussein come to power. So that was Iraq. Iran, 1953, you had the CIA, and this was actually admitted by the CIA 25 years after the fact in 1978. They released papers confirming that they had actually installed the Shah. He was a pro-West leader in Iran, and the idea was to have an anti-Soviet, anti-communist, pro-West leader. And you really did see, and while there are certainly criticisms and imperfections that you could point out about that society, for the most part, you saw a lot of prosperity during that time because you had Tehran, the capital of Iran, really become a real first world type city. I mean, indistinguishable from a place like New York or Toronto or London or any of those other Western capitals. And you had women, of course, achieving prosperity and equality and attending college and working and, enjoying the rights that we saw that we've seen women enjoy across the West. And then something interesting happened in the 60s and 70s. You saw that the Saudis really were not being very agreeable to the agenda of the West, which revolved around Israel, the same conflict we're dealing with today. I discussed on an episode of Breaking History a few weeks back, maybe a month back. I explained the anecdote of the Ikhwan, which was the original Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1902 by Abdulaziz al-Saud, who Ibn Saud is as he's known. This would be MBS, the current crown prince of Saudi Arabia, his grandfather. He was about 20, 25 at the time. This is at the beginning of the 20th century. He had been driven into exile with his mother when he was a child, and basically was encouraged by a number of people, namely British agents, to go home, but go back home to Riyadh and retake his ancestral homeland from the tribe that had driven him out under the orders of the Ottoman Empire. And so he did that, and he did that by going around and recruiting young men who really didn't have much to live for. They didn't have much of an economy. They didn't really have many prospects. They were Bedouin, which is the term for the nomads in Arabia. And so he put swords in their hands basically and said, "Let's go take back what's ours." And he called them the Ikhwan. I don't have the whole name memorized, but Ikhwan means the brethren. And they were officially known as the Muslim Brotherhood. So he formed the Muslim Brotherhood. Really, mostly they didn't really conquer that many people. It was really a lot of it was bought off because he was receiving gold every month from the British. So he was using the gold to buy the loyalty of the tribes in Eastern Arabia. But and when they weren't agreeable to that, that's when there would be kinetic conflict with the Ikhwan. And then around 1925, after he took Mecca and Medina from the Hashemites, the Ikhwan wanted to continue this jihad. It's important to understand that Wahhabism, as I've explained on Breaking History, and I'm sure some of you have seen that episode, but Wahhabism was officially formed in 1744 under the Pact of Diriyah between the original patriarch of the House of Saud and his partner, Al-Wahhab. That's where the term Wahhabism comes from. And it was basically a political theocratic dynasty where this guy Al-Wahhab had a really radical interpretation of Islam, not nearly as radical as it is today. It became progressively more radicalized, especially under the British influence in the 20th century. But it was a far more radical version of Islam, and it was so radical that his own family disowned him, and he was driven out of his hometown, and he basically lived as like a hermit, like wandering around the Middle East for years until he came across Al-Saud, the original Al-Saud, and they formed this alliance. And so Wahhabism really became like a cornerstone of the House of Saud. And so the Ikhwan, these were all like true believers. The Muslim Brotherhood were true believers of this radical interpretation of Islam, which had become more radical since the days of Al-Wahhab. And they wanted to see this jihad continue. They wanted to follow in the footsteps of the caliphates of the past and kind of form like a new caliphate that just kept spreading and spreading and take over the whole Islamic world. And Ibn Saud had already signed treaties with the British to recognize the territorial sovereignty of the neighbors, Jordan, Transjordan rather, Iraq, Kuwait. And so he said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do any more raids. We're not going to do any more attacks. We're just going to stick to our own territory that we've been given and form a kingdom. And so they continued doing these raids. And for years, between 1925 and 1927, they were doing these raids in Transjordan and Kuwait and Iraq, and really upsetting the neighbors, upsetting the British, some of the British. But Ibn Saud actually sent an agent into their camp and learned that they had been influenced by British intelligence. They had been given gold and money and told to basically revolt against Ibn Saud and usurp him as the leader of this movement, because the British, or the British intelligence, the nefarious factions within Britain, were worried that Ibn Saud was not going to be agreeable to a railroad that was supposed to be, that they wanted to build between Palestine, then at the time it was Palestine, but it would become Israel, Haifa, and Basra in Iraq. And that would have effectively connected the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean by a railway. But it would have had to go through Saudi Arabia, and it certainly would have needed the approval of the House of Saud, and they didn't think they were going to get that, and they were right. I mean, he would not have been very agreeable to that, only because he knew at the time in the 1920s, he knew about the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration in 1917, a letter written by Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, where they promised to one day colonize Palestine and form a state of Israel. And so he was very much aware of this. He was not going to be agreeable to the railway. So therefore, the Ikhwan were convinced to revolt against him and overthrow him. He then formed a new army to go after the Ikhwan, and they had 3 major battles um, in 1928, and he defeated the Ikhwan. They were destroyed. At the same time, the Ikhwan were reborn in Cairo, which was under heavy British occupation. And Matt's talked about this in the past, and I will allow him to detail this once we get to the Q&A in more depth. But basically, you had guys who were Islamic scholars who were on their payroll in Cairo who were forming madrasas, schools, and they were teaching these radical ideas. Salafi Islam, which is Wahhabism, technically falls under Salafi. Salafi Islam is the radical interpretations of Islam. And one of the students would then go on to form the new Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, and that's really the Muslim Brotherhood that we know today. In a way, it was sort of revitalized in the 50s, and so a lot of people say it really started in the 50s, but it really started in 1928 under this guy Hassan al-Banna. And so the Muslim Brotherhood that we know today was started by British intelligence in Cairo, although the origins of it, the idea of it, the name of it, the Ikhwan, came from the House of Saud. And there's something to me a little poetic about that, about how Ibn Saud started this thing and then he had to destroy his own creation because it had become a monster and turned on him. And, he really did, for all the criticisms of him, and I'm sure there's plenty, he really did actually have kind of an earnest concept of trying to bring prosperity to the region. He didn't want this radical, like hyper radicalization of like a Sharia society, as far as I've read, that these younger guys kind of saw for themselves, because they saw this opportunity to really establish themselves as like this new oligarchy over the region. And so ever since then, we've seen this model implemented, and this goes back to the days of the East India Company, which Matt and I have also talked about. That's where that model was really cultivated. But the idea of proxy militias and investing money and resources into rival gangs, rival leaders, in order to harass and frustrate governments and destabilize regions, destabilize communities, destabilize countries. And that's what's been happening in the Middle East ever since, for the past 100 years. And so now that brings us back to Iran, 1953. For 25 years, Iran was a really prosperous place. And then all of a sudden, you had these incidents in the 60s and 70s where, you had the 1961, you had King Faisal. So King Faisal was of Saudi Arabia. He looks like a villain if you look at a picture of him, and I'll try to pull one up before we get to the Q&A section. But he kind of looks like a villain if you look. I mean, he looks like he's sent out from Central Casting, like a Hollywood movie. And but he actually was really as far as I could tell, like a populist who really did care about his people, and he was trying to kind of keep the West at like an arm's length, because he understood. I think he understood that they were not necessarily working for the best interest of his people. He had a negotiation with JFK in 1961 where they signed an agreement that resulted in the abolition of slavery in Saudi Arabia, because slavery was still existed in 1961 in Saudi Arabia. It was JFK who actually got slavery abolished, and it was King Faisal who did that. And then in 1967, you had the Six-Day War, and this was when Israel invaded the West Bank, Golan Heights in Syria, and even like in the parts of southern Lebanon on the north. And they occupied with the West Bank. The West Bank has been under military occupation ever since 1967. And that's the whole idea. Everything that's happening right now between Palestine and Israel goes back to really 1948 when Britain colonized Palestine. But 1967 is when the IDF occupied the West Bank, and they've been there ever since, and they patrol the streets there. So that was 1967. 6 years later, in 1973, you have the Yom Kippur War, and Faisal. You had the West, Canada, Britain, America, I think Japan, and a few others backing Israel in this war. And so, as punishment, Faisal enacts the oil embargo. Some of you may be familiar with this. where we saw a major price spike in the West on gas prices. Lasted for about 6 months, and then Henry Kissinger and others came in and kind of strong armed the Saudis and got them to agree to ending the embargo. And this was where the petrodollar was created. And I think the petrodollar, that the creation of the petrodollar is probably outside of the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, probably the worst thing that's ever happened to the American economy, the Western economy, the U.S. dollar. But really, it gave all this power to the House of Saud because they now could effectively kind of control the value of the U.S. dollar through oil prices, because the world was started trading oil using the U.S. dollar, which really ties the U.S. dollar to the price of oil in a lot of ways. So after that, this is like we're leaving facts now, or hard facts, and we're going more into my own speculation and what I've been working on. It seems to me that during that time, the 60s and the 70s, really in 1973, I think there was like just this epiphany, or this moment where this decision was made among the nefarious rulers in the West, that the House of Saud had to go, that they were a liability, and all it took was one true populist like Faisal, and they could undo everything. They could ruin all their plans. And so therefore they had to get rid of the House of Saud and replace them with something a little more manageable. And so it seems to me that a decision was made then to create Iran as this new center of influence in the Middle East, because up until then, Saudi Arabia had really been like our in the region. And so what they did is they had, in 1978, the CIA released some papers that confirmed that they had actually installed the Shah. The Shah was a Western puppet, so to speak, as far as the people there were concerned in Iran. And there was a lot of rhetoric, like color revolution type rhetoric, occurring throughout Iran, where the people were being indoctrinated to believe that their culture wasn't really their culture, that it had been kind of planted onto them, grafted onto them by the West, and that they were losing their identity. They were losing their culture identity. They needed to return to their Islamic roots. They needed to become more pro-Islam, adopt more of the ideology that was in Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi is a Sunni nation, and Iran is a Shia nation, and those are rivals in the Islamic world. So there's this really, really interesting. I read this book. I've gone back and read it a couple times, but this is a book called MBS. It was written by it's a biography that's written by a guy named Ben Hubbard. He's a New York Times journalist. I call him kind of a CIA apologist because he is very apologetic of the CIA in this, and has a really, really soft spot for them and Qatar and all the bad actors. Everyone that we know who's a bad actor, he has a really soft spot for them. You can just tell. And he's trying to cast it. This book was released in 2020. It was used to cast MBS as like this murderous psychopath, this sociopath that can't be trusted. But there's a lot of really great content that like interviews and quotes and stuff that he pulls from people in the region. And if you know enough about the region and the history, and you're able to use your objective analysis, you can actually see through the lies in the book, and you can really start to understand, okay, like this guy is completely full of it, and really this is the opposite of what he's trying to present. And specifically, the part where MBS talks about Iran and talks about the Iranian Revolution, it really caught my eye. And so what he says is that I'm going to quote him here. He says, when it came time to, before we start the quote, when it came time to end Wahhabism, the thing about Wahhabism is that they've always said, well, Wahhabism isn't real. It's not a real thing. It's just Islam. Like that's what the clerics in Saudi have always said. There's no such thing as Wahhabism. They've never called it Wahhabism. They don't have any sort of like written scripture for it. It's just their interpretation of Islam. So MBS took that and he turned it against them by saying, yeah, you're right, there is no such thing as Wahhabism. And so therefore, I'm going to arrest all the corrupt clerics who are Wahhabi clerics, and I'm going to expel all the ones who aren't corrupt. I'm just going to expel them from the government, and we're going to close down the Sharia police, and we're just going to stop practicing Sharia law, and nobody should make a big deal out of it because Wahhabism isn't real. Remember, this is just Islam. And so his quote is, "We will not waste 30 years of our lives dealing with any extremist ideas. We will destroy them today immediately." And that's exactly what they did in 2017. Basically just ended it with the Saudi purge. He has said since then that they still have some, there's still some cultural aspects of Wahhabism that are there that they're still trying to root out that aren't going to be gone overnight. But for the most part, most of it's gone, and they're working more and more. They just opened up their first liquor store the other day. So they are progressively getting there. But we don't want them to go too progressive because we don't want them to become a degenerate society like a lot of Western communities have become. So he also goes on to say, "We were not like this in the past. We are only returning to what we were: moderate, balanced Islam that is open to the world and to all religions and to all traditions and peoples." Um, and then the book says, this is what Hubbard is saying, he would continue to make the argument in future interviews, and it was picked up by his boosters in the West. It revolved around the year 1979 when two monumental events altered the trajectory of the Middle East. The first was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which toppled the Shah and put in its place a system of rule by Shiite clerics who sought to implement their version of an Islamic society at home while exporting their revolution abroad. The second was the armed takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by apocalyptic Saudi militants who accused the royal family and the clerics of losing their legitimacy to corruption and westernization. Before 1979, Saudi Arabia's ideological competitors in the region had mostly been Arab nationalists and socialists inspired by the Soviet Union, but the Iranian Revolution created a regime that competed with the Saudis at their own game of basing their rule on a claim to Islamic orthodoxy. So I found that really, really interesting because basically what happened, as MBS explains it in interviews and other quotes, basically what happened is November 20th, 1979, you had the Ikhwan, as they called themselves, the Muslim Brotherhood. They took over Mecca like at gunpoint. And for 2 weeks until December 4th, they held Mecca. And it was like this big, kind of like hostage type crisis that was really being overshadowed globally by the Iranian Revolution. And because you actually had American hostages taken in that case, and, the whole Jimmy Carter, like Ronald Reagan narrative and how that whole crisis unfolded. But in the background, you had this other situation in Saudi Arabia where these militants took over Mecca and were basically saying, we need to become more orthodox, more Muslim, more like more pure, less westernized and more Islamic. And as we've covered on Breaking History, the real like match point, like the real like matchbox situation, tinderbox situation in Iran was a movie theater. The doors were barred. There were about almost 500 people in this movie theater. The doors were barred from the outside. Jet fuel was poured on the building, and it was lit on fire, and everyone inside was burned alive. And that's what actually started the Iranian Revolution. I think that was August of 1979, if I remember correctly. People took to the streets. That's when you really started to get like the actual color revolution began. And it ultimately resulted in the installation of the Ayatollah and this really hyper radicalized form of Shia Islam. And as Hubbard points out in this book, really he's just quoting MBS and just citing MBS's thinking. But MBS is saying that was a major fulcrum year because not only did you have militants in Saudi Arabia saying we in Saudi Arabia need to become more orthodox, you had militants in Iran saying the same thing. And so it almost became like this arms race between Iran and Saudi to say who can win the hearts and minds of the Islamic world by becoming more more anti-West and more pro-Islam. And so because of that, it's almost like they were pushing each other to become more radicalized. And so that's why you had movie theaters being shut down, liquor stores being shut down, coffee shops being shut down, Sharia police being formed, more and more progressively since 1979 and through the 80s. You had a more radicalized measures being implemented in these two societies, because they were trying to outdo the other one, which I thought was fascinating. And then at the same time, in the 80s, you also had the like what did you have, Matt? The 70s, you had Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Mika Brzezinski's father, who started the Trilateral Commission with Henry Kissinger in 1973, same year as the embargo. You had he then went on to become National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter. He funded madrasas throughout the Middle East that taught these radicalized versions of interpretations of Islam. He was working with Osama bin Laden, funding him, arming him, training him to fight the Russians, to fight the Soviets. And then in the 80s, you had all these different militant groups forming in like throughout the Middle East that were Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, these groups that we have now become familiar with today, that all sprung up in the 80s as a product of this radicalization that occurred, that was really being manipulated by the West, by Western intelligence agencies. And while some of these groups, like I've heard that Hezbollah, maybe like these mujahideen as they're called, which really just means like patriot, just means like, freedom fighter. They could have started in earnest, but they just get co-opted by these Western intelligence agencies. And so now you have Hamas. Hamas was actually being propped up and formed by the Muslim Brotherhood and by Israel itself and Bibi Netanyahu. And Bibi Netanyahu has admitted this. Ron Paul said it many years ago that Ron Paul actually came out, I think, and said it again on October 9th. He said that after the attack, he said Hamas was created by the Israeli government. It was a product of the Shin Bet of Mossad. It's like they were the ones who actually created Hamas, and the reason they did it was because they wanted it to serve as a almost like a stalking horse, like a straw man, as a justification for them to annex Palestine and take it over and make it part of, because they would use it to destabilize the more progressive, moderate factions, Yasser Arafat. And that's what Ron Paul said. Ron Paul said that Hamas was created to undermine and ultimately overthrow Yasser Arafat and replace him with a more militant government that could then be crushed, and justifiably so, in the hearts and minds of the people. And so right now, like, let's just bring this all back to what like the topic is at hand, like the modern day. Right now, what's being pushed really, really hard across all Western outlets, Western media outlets, is that these militant groups across the Middle East are like this network of groups are being funded by Iran. I don't believe that. I actually don't think that's what the case. I think that's what was supposed to happen, because I think what was really supposed to happen, I've explained it on Breaking History before, but I think what was supposed to happen is that Saudi Arabia was supposed to collapse. They were their investment fund that is used to fund their entire government was supposed to go insolvent in 2017. Had MBS not come to power, had his father not made him defense minister in 2015, and he looked at their budget and realized that they were hemorrhaging $100 billion a year, that which is a quarter of their annual budget, he wouldn't have like made monumental changes to their economy and restructure their entire government to save them from insolvency. And had they gone insolvent, had the House of Saud gone insolvent, they would have been overthrown by rival families in the region, and Saudi Arabia would have become like a Yemen or like a Somalia. So had that happened, like the way that it looked like it was going to happen, Iran, which throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was being propped up by both the Democrats and the Republicans in America. You had the Bush administration, who was invading Iraq and bombing the Middle East, saying that Islam is the enemy, at the same time saying that Iran is actually our friend. And Iran, like Condoleezza Rice saying Iran actually isn't that bad, and Iran really is the future the Middle East and not Saudi Arabia. Obama doubled down on that rhetoric and said that he really pivoted from a policy standpoint away from Saudi Arabia and towards Iran. And so if Saudi Arabia weren't around right now, I think you would already be in World War III right now. I think right now you would already have a major regional war. Iran and Israel would already be at war with one another. But as we've covered on Breaking History, I do think that MBS has succeeded in reforming the Ummah, uniting the entire Muslim world behind him, including Iran. And because of that, I find it very, very hard to believe that Iran is working with MBS, but at the same time trying to undermine him and serving the interests of Israel. Because if they were actually doing what the media is accusing them of doing, that would then give Israel the justification to continue their military campaign, which Iran doesn't really want them to do. So none of that makes any sense. But what I have discovered, Matt, is I've discovered in the past few days, in the past week, really, Fox News came out with this article, and I'm no fan of Fox News at all, but Fox News came out and a number of others, but Fox News was just the biggest outlet that had it. Let me share my screen so I can make this a little easier to follow. You have, where did I share screen? I'm just going to share my window. Okay, so if you can see my screen, you have exclusive alleged Qatar spy operation said to have targeted GOP lawmakers opposed to Muslim Brotherhood. So what this details is that the state of Qatar hired a former CIA agent's company to go after Ted Cruz and a number of other lawmakers who oppose Hamas, its parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're trying to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. This is back in like 2017, 2016, 2017, when Donald Trump came into office. The guy's name, he's an ex-CIA agent named Kevin Chalker. His company is called Global Risk Advisors. And I can tell you from this book, from Ben Hubbard's book, he is sitting here talking about all of his friends from the State Department. He names them by name. These NGOs, the Qatar Foundation, they all operate in Qatar. Qatar is this major like hub of like American presence, like American intelligence presence. The State Department. I don't know if you can you see this map, Matt? Is this map showing up?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to give everyone a sense, I want everyone to have their bearings. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then right here is Qatar. This little peninsula just sticks off of Saudi Arabia. So Doha, you probably remember hearing about the Doha agreement, where Trump and the Taliban formed an agreement that America would leave Afghanistan forever if the Taliban agreed to hunt proxy militias, like terrorist groups that were working in the area, and they've done that. They've been hunting down ISIS, which of course is a CIA proxy. So yeah, because Qatar is where the State Department really operates out of, and the CIA really operate out of, is Qatar. And now that we've closed down Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, the largest military base, U.S. military base in the world, is in Qatar. So Qatar is a major epicenter of U.S. foreign policy in the State Department and the CIA. So getting back to Project Endgame, as they called this. So I dug into this document. They actually have a document right here. And it's a 12-page document. We won't go through the whole thing, but I just want to point out that what it is, Endgame, when they call it Project Endgame, Endgame is a person. And so they explain right here that Endgame is, where is he? Endgame is the most powerful ambassador in the U.S. He has allies and assets across Washington, D.C., ready to do his bidding. Endgame co-ops journalists with expensive gifts and attends the highly influential Sun Valley Conference. Qatar must act immediately because Endgame has infiltrated Trump's inner circle. Endgame is charming and speaks perfect English. He directly handles reporters to shape media narratives, set their lobbying agenda, and manages their assets and think tanks. So when they says that he speaks perfect English, the implication there, of course, is that Endgame is not an American. He's a foreign ambassador in DC. and I have found out who that is. It is this guy, Yusef Taba, and he is actually right here. This article from January 31st, 2017, from the Huffington Post. Yusef Taba is the most charming man in Washington. So this is, in my opinion, absolutely in game. And what I won't go through every single. I'm actually working on an article right now. I'm trying to write it tonight, and hopefully it'll get published on the Badlands Media Substack in the next week or two. But my new thesis that I've developed is that if you go back and look at what this is, this report that was commissioned by this CIA agent's company for the Muslim Brotherhood in March of 2017, right after Trump came to power. Basically what they were trying to do is they were trying to go after in-game. They were trying to go after Yusef Otaiba. The UAE is MBS's number one ally. The leader of the UAB, who's known as MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, he took MBS under his wing. He's the one who really lobbied for MBS to become the next crown prince, the next leader of Saudi Arabia. And they worked together in 2018 with Donald Trump to embargo and sanction Qatar, accusing them of basically serving as the proxy hub for all of these radical Islamic terror groups. The allegations that are being levied at Iran right now by the Western media were actually being levied at Qatar by Donald Trump, Mohammed bin Salman, and the UAE back in 2018. So this all makes sense. It would make sense that they would be going after the UAE ambassador, they would be going after MBS, and they'd be going after Donald Trump, because those three entities are seeking to basically destroy this, whatever this thing is, this cabal that operates in Qatar. So what I think this all comes back to, Matt, is I think it comes back to Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered in October 2018. There's a guy, John Cullen, who did excellent research on the Vegas shooting. If you go look up his YouTube videos, he has really nailed it. I think he has proven beyond all reasonable doubt that the most likely explanation for the Vegas shooting in October 2017 was a failed assassination attempt on MBS. There's reasons to believe that MBS was in Vegas doing training with U.S. Special Forces. We have friends who actually guys from Badlands who were at the concert that night, whose friends were shot right next to them. They lived, but were shot in the leg. And they told me just 2 weeks ago when we were at GART in California at our convention, he said there were two helicopters over top of the concert shooting at them. And he said to this day, he still gets PTSD from helicopters because of that. And that's the same thing that John Cullen argued, by the way. So John Cullen's argument is that he actually believes that MBS did kill Jamal Khashoggi, because Khashoggi was allegedly killed the very minute, a year later, at the exact minute that the Vegas shooting began. And that was a message that the Saudis were sending to their enemies about, and Cullen believes that MBS or that Jamal Khashoggi was the one who orchestrated the failed hit on MBS. I don't believe that. I don't think he has the resources to do it. But I don't believe that the Saudis killed Khashoggi. I didn't buy that when the story first came out. I just said it didn't fit MBS's character. It doesn't line up with what he was trying to achieve globally. He was trying to present himself as this progressive, moderate, reasonable Arab that the world could deal with, and he was going to revolutionize the Middle East and make the Middle East this prosperous, stable region. It doesn't make sense that he'd be assassinating journalists who got on his nerves. So what I do believe happened is I do believe that the Muslim Brotherhood, working with the CIA in Qatar, they either killed Khashoggi or Khashoggi's still alive because his body's never been recovered. And that whole thing was just like a psychological operation, like a false narrative put out there. And the whole point of the hit was to undermine MBS's ability to rally the world around him and basically try to revolutionize the Middle East and throw the CIA and British intelligence in the West out of the Middle East forever so that they could achieve this prosperity. Here's an article from The Intercept. Now, wait, real quick. Let's go back to this. You're going to laugh at this, Matt. Right here, he says, we are going to use our media assets. This guy identifies media assets, 4 media assets that belong to Qatar. A guy named Max Blumenthal, who's like a journalist in the U.S., an outlet called the Middle East Eye, an outlet called the New York Times, and an outlet called The Intercept. And he said, we're going to use these assets to deploy narratives to counter in-game and to basically destroy his credibility and basically destroy MBS and the Saudis' reputation. So here you have an Intercept article from okay. So here you have it. This is an article from October 2018 from The Intercept. And basically what it's saying is it's saying that Youssef Al-Otaiba is left holding the bag because he's been going around for the past like year and a half telling everyone in DC that Mohammed bin Salman is a reformer. He's the future of the Middle East. He's a great guy. He's somebody we can trust, we can work with. And what Ryan Grimm is saying in this article is that MBS is just more of the same. He's just a ruthless Arab who's just going to talk out of both sides of his mouth. And he's going to kill people he doesn't like. He's going to take out his enemies. He's this ruthless warlord who is, power hungry and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how this like narrative deployment that the Saudis killed Jamal Khashoggi. And the official story is that Khashoggi went into the Saudi, because he's a Saudi citizen, but he had fled Saudi Arabia in fear of his life. When MBS came to power, is that he returned to Turkey, went into the Saudi embassy in Turkey, and then was basically grabbed in the street, dragged into the embassy, and then brutally murdered by Saudi operatives, Saudi special forces, whatever, Saudi intelligence, people working for MBS. And this was all done under the orders of MBS. And if you go and you look at, and this is what's going to be in the article I'm going to put out, but if you go and you look at the narrative deployments, the media deployments that came out around this time, it's all unnamed sources from the State Department. It's all CIA leaks. CIA leaks confirm that Khashoggi was killed by MBS's order. The whole thing is just MBS or the CIA saying, "Hey guys, trust us. We know for a fact that MBS killed Khashoggi. You have to trust us on this." And so I think this all ties back to what's happening right now because they're kind of doing the same thing with Iran. They're trying to convince the world that Iran is this really despicable, evil regime that needs to be destroyed, and that we, the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, we have like a moral obligation to go over there and go to war with Iran on behalf of Israel. And if we don't, then, we're going to have more of the same kind of rhetoric they were using post 9/11 to justify Iraq and Afghanistan and everything else. So very, very interesting stuff. But to summarize everything, and then we can I'll open the floor up to everyone else. It seems to me that the real proxy state is not Iran. I think Iran was supposed to be the proxy state, but I think that Donald Trump, MBS, good actors were able to basically work with people from Iran to drive those bad actors who had embedded themselves in the Iranian regime and were working with the CIA to bring about this World War III situation. I think they were able to successfully thwart that, and they were able to stave off that conflict. But Qatar, I think, is really the real proxy state. I think Qatar is the proxy state. I think whenever I say Muslim Brotherhood, what I really mean is British intelligence. That's a name, by the way, that you never hear mentioned. You only hear CIA and Muslim Brotherhood. You never hear British intelligence mentioned. That's because I think the Muslim Brotherhood is British intelligence. But yeah, so I think what you have right now is you have these proxy groups. We don't know for certain who's running them, but it would make more sense that it was Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, the CIA, British intelligence running those groups than actually Iran, as they're telling us.
Thank you, Gordon. Now that's a really good geopolitical overview masterclass. I mean, there's so many things, so many ways I could describe what you just did. There's a lot of questions, obviously, that have arisen in the audience as you were speaking. I have a few thoughts, but I'm gonna hold back for now. I'm gonna let people throw you some possibly soft, possibly hard balls, possibly curve balls. We'll see. But Kevin first was the first to get his name in there. So Kevin Champagne, it is all yours.
Hey, Gordon, thanks for being here.
Hey, Kevin.
Um, I have a question because you mentioned your thesis is that MBS is working with Iran to unify all the Middle East. One big problem in that whole endeavor is Yemen. And I've heard, but haven't been able to confirm it, that there's some family ties on MBS's maybe his mother's side with Yemen. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, if you can comment on that and in a broader picture, what's MBS's outlook? What's his plan regarding Yemen? Because it seems that since he's been appointed as the new crown prince, there's been some change, but the Yemeni train, so to speak, uh, had already left the station. So yeah, what's the deal here?
That's a really, really good question. Fantastic question. Thank you for asking it. Let me share my screen so I can just use this map because this map will be helpful. Okay. So Yemen, this is Yemen down here. So Riyadh is where Diriyah, really, which is like a suburb of Riyadh, is where the House of Saud, that's where the Saudis come from. Over here, Mecca, they don't have Medina, but Medina is about right here. So Mecca and Medina, which are the two holy cities of Islam, this entire like coastal area right here is called the Kingdom of Hijaz. I think I'm saying that right. But that's the Hashemite kingdom that I was referring to. So the Hashemite kingdom was basically this coastal area right here, and now the Hashemites, the only place they rule is Jordan. So you asked about MBS's mother. So yes, MBS's mother actually does come from a tribe, and the way it works in Arabia, and some of you may know this, that your whole identity comes from your tribe. And the way it works is you have your family, your direct family. I think it's 3 generations. Your generation, your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation. That's a family. Multiple families make up a clan. Multiple clans make up a tribe. Multiple tribes make up a nation. So your whole identity kind of stems from your tribe, like what tribe you come from. It's a very, very important thing. And so his mother comes from a tribe that actually, I believe, is from this region right here. What you're saying is like the border of Yemen. So yes, she is from a tribe that is actually has ties to the Hashemites and ties to Yemen. His father is obviously from the House of Saud. And Yemen, they actually went to war with Yemen. So he became, as I mentioned before, his father appointed him a defense minister in January 2015 when his father became king. And he immediately went to war, like within like a week, went to war, heavy war with Yemen, because Yemen had this problem in Western Yemen where the Houthis, or the Houthis, were trying to overthrow the government. They had like their own color revolution, like violent. It had turned kinetic, and so lots of Air Force bombing by the Saudi Air Force in Western Yemen. That is a conflict that went on for basically 8 years until last year. Trump gave them Patriot missile systems. Basically, MBS asked the United States for a Patriot missile system. I think it was Congress denied them at first, and then all of a sudden, the Houthis were able to blow up a oil field or oil pipeline in southern Saudi Arabia, and that impacted obviously like the oil markets. So then Trump stepped in and said, "What are y'all doing? Why are y'all not giving them these missile systems?" He immediately gave them all the missile systems they needed. Biden comes to power. Trump also designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. One of the first things Biden did is he undesignated them a terrorist. He took them off that list. He took back the Patriot missile systems. He made them all like demobilized. They were then remobilized, I think, sometime last year. But about a year ago, you actually had a peace treaty signed between the Houthis and the Saudis. And so basically, MBS had brought that conflict, at least the violence. He had brought the violence to an end, and that's what his whole rhetoric has been like with Israel and Gaza and everything. Is like, let's stop the fighting, let's come to the table and start talking. He's like, if we can get the dialogue going, then at least people can stop dying. And that's the progress he was making with Yemen. So Yemen, the official narrative is that they're being run by Iranians. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is operating in Yemen, and there could be truth to that. We don't know. I mean, that there could be truth to it. You know, at Badlands, we talk a lot about narrative deployments in the news. You know, how much of this stuff like that we're hearing in the news from Western news outlets can we actually believe? We don't know. We could be being told a complete lie, complete fabrication. But the official narrative is that the Houthis are being backed financially and armed by Iran. And I have a few different ways of looking at this. One of the guys at Badlands, Burning Bright, he calls it bicameral thinking, or omnicameral thinking. It's basically a way of looking at a story with multiple possibilities so that you don't really like lose your sanity trying to track this stuff. But, you know, the Houthis could be backed by Iran. They could be backed by, you know, the bad actors there, could be backed by the CIA, Muslim Brotherhood. It's possible that maybe they are being backed by Iran and they are actually operating in earnest. And the things that they're doing right now in the Red Sea, where they're attacking these ships, maybe they're not doing that by like under order from MBS and you know, the alliance, the sovereign alliance, as some of the guys at Badlands call it, which would be like the white hat alliance. But they know, just from like game theory, from gaming this out, they know that if there's a conflict between Gaza and Israel, they know that these Houthis are going to start attacking ships in order to try to leverage Israel into a ceasefire. So it's possible that that's what's happening. It's possible that these guys in Yemen are acting in earnest and they actually are doing this. And maybe this is exactly what the people who want peace to come to be want to happen. We don't really know. It does seem that we are getting a net positive from the entire thing, because what's happening now is because the Houthis have shut down this the Suez Canal effectively, or at least really frustrated its operations. You're now getting like this eagerness, like this anxiousness from the Western community, which may or may not necessarily be invested. People who may not be invested in the Gaza conflict are suddenly invested in it because they're seeing like their oil, like gas prices go up. They're seeing the, you know, global trade being affected. They're seeing like the economy suffer because of it. So while obviously like piracy is not a good thing and it's not something that we want, in certain situations, maybe piracy spurs a conversation or spurs a dialogue that needs to occur in order to bring about ultimately peace. So I look at it like that. Like I look at it like maybe Iran, and same thing goes for all these other militias that are operating throughout the region. You know, they announced the other day, I did Badlands Daily, which is our daily news show on Thursday. I filled in for someone and we covered the news headline that the U.S. is pulling out of Syria. So the U.S. the U.S. military has occupied Syria for the past 10 years, and now we're finally leaving. They also announced this past weekend that we're leaving we're now going to actually leave Iraq finally. So these militia groups that are reportedly attacking these bases in Syria and Iraq, you know, maybe they are being backed by Iran. Maybe they are like mujahideen who are acting in earnest, who truly are freedom fighters who are trying to get the foreign invaders out of their land forever. Maybe. They could also be, you know, CIA proxies that are trying to instigate conflict and justify a doubling down where more troops come in and we get like an escalation in conflict. So I think we have to see how this plays out, but it's a very interesting point, and that is honestly, that's like one of the biggest sticking points for me is trying to wrap my head around Yemen and like what's happening there. what's happening with this like network of militia groups, because it is hard to figure out. I can't help but wonder, how does Qatar play into all this? Like do they have relationships with these groups? So it's a very interesting thing, because what we do know is we know that Qatar does not get along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are traditionally great allies of the West, but the American global hegemony, the Anglo cabal, like whatever you want to call it, the Anglo Empire, we know that Qatar has really become their hub. But despite the fact that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been great allies for us, we instead go to their enemy, Qatar, and that's where we invest, our military infrastructure. That's where the CIA, the State Department, the countless NGOs that launder billions and billions of dollars from tax dollars from America, they all run through Qatar. And Qatar, by the way, also to this day still has slavery. The UAE doesn't have slavery. Saudi Arabia doesn't have slavery, but Qatar does practice slavery today. They say that like the big difference between Dubai and which is in the UAE and Doha and Qatar, they say the big difference is that you'll see Ferraris and Lamborghinis driving around in Abu Dhabi, but in Dubai, but if you go to Doha, you will see slaves driving, like parking Ferraris and Lamborghinis. So it's like Qatar just seems like a very, very backwards place. It makes no sense that we would have invested so much of our infrastructure and our like NGOs and billions of dollars there, but yet we have. So that's like a contradiction that really needs to be resolved. And that's something that I kind of want to resolve with the articles that I want to write on this. I hope that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I guess it's still an unresolved issue in the end, Yemen. But what I get from it is that this whole rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is the real context to be looked at here, because it seems to be changing the whole picture in the region, including Yemen, but you talked about Syria and Iraq too, which I guess we'll see in 2024 where this leads up to, right?
Yes, correct. And another thing to point out real quick is that like Matt and I have looked at Sudan and Ethiopia. We've talked about this on the show, but like we talked about how like the strong presence that the British intelligence have had in Egypt. They've also had a strong presence in Sudan, historically. But now all of a sudden, Sudan announced in February of last year, they finally accepted a proposal from Putin and Russia to build a Navy base on the coast here, which would be right across the water from Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. has a Navy base in Saudi Arabia. So, and then all of a sudden, right after that, you had like these proxy militias pop up in Sudan, and now they've been in civil war for the past year. So, that makes me raise an eyebrow. Like, okay, so all of a sudden, we're getting all this stability and the Abraham Accords and all this peace up here in the Middle East, and now all of a sudden you're getting destabilizing events in Sudan. Russia, by the way, doesn't have one military base in Africa. They're going to build their first military base in Sudan. It's amazing to me that Russia has never built a military base in Africa until now. But the fact that now you're seeing these proxy militias pop up in Eastern Africa, it makes me think that the CIA really wants to maintain some bases, like some clandestine bases of operation in this region, probably to launch operations against Saudi Arabia and its allies.
Mm-hmm.
And so Yemen would kind of tie into that theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, I know you got like 3 or 4 questions there, but maybe pick 1 or 2 of those questions. Go for it, Peter.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Gordon. So here's my first question. We're going back a little bit in history. Why was King Faisal assassinated and MBS has survived? Were their goals similar? Were their enemies the same?
Yes, that's a great question. That is something I glossed over. I skipped over. I didn't even mention it. But so 1973, the petrodollar, the oil embargo. 2 years later, 1975, King Faisal is assassinated by his nephew, who was considered like deranged or mentally imbalanced or whatever. He had just returned from a very long trip to Virginia, apparently in the United States, which is where the CIA is headquartered. It's where I live. And it's a very odd thing to come to Virginia, because Virginia, there's not really like a ton. There's plenty to do here, but it's just very strange for someone from Saudi Arabia to come here randomly, like to be part of the royal family. It's like you would think that they were doing something with the federal government, because we house a lot of the federal government infrastructure, the intelligence community, the military. A lot of that is housed here in Virginia. And so it just makes me think, it's like, why not go to New York? Why not go to LA? Why not go to Chicago? Why not go to Atlanta? It's like, oh, you came to Virginia, of all places. The suspicion, there's a lot of suspicion that he was actually like being maybe like brainwashed, like MK Ultra or whatever, by the CIA, and programmed to go back home and murder his uncle, because he basically just walked right up to him and shot him. Because being his nephew, I guess he was able to get a gun in. But yeah, it's a really, really good point. So Faisal, yes, I would look at Faisal and I would say that he was very much had a similar agenda, it seems like, to what MBS is doing. I think MBS has a greater vision than what maybe Faisal had. I think MBS understands maybe the landscape a little better than Faisal did. I think he has a lot more charisma and a lot more like panache maybe to pull it off. It's interesting that Faisal's son, so if y'all remember, it was around like October 10th. It was a few days after, maybe like a week after the attack, the October 7th attack. A guy came out and spoke. He was the first person from Saudi Arabia to come out and give a public statement. And he actually came out and condemned both sides, which caught a lot of people by surprise. He said there are no heroes in this conflict. There are no good guys. We condemn both Israel and Hamas for what's happening right now. The guy who said that, his name was Turki bin Faisal. That was Faisal's son. And he was actually, I think, in charge of Saudi intelligence for a number of years. But digging in on that guy, it sounds to me like this is Faisal's son. He actually, despite being heavily involved in Saudi intelligence, he actually kept his distance from the CIA. He was not somebody, like in this guy's book, this guy lists off people who are considered like best friends with the CIA, close, like reliable allies of the CIA. And he paints them as like the heroes of the story, who are all targeted by MBS, who are all of them are arrested by MBS and basically like persecuted by him. And Turki al-Faisal is not one of them. Turki al-Faisal is actually somebody who kept his distance from the CIA. And because of that, Ben Hubbard paints him as kind of a nefarious creature. It's just interesting to me. And I made the comment at the time that Faisal's son is the guy who comes out and makes this statement. And I just couldn't help but wonder at the time that, like, and that's what led me to kind of dig in more on Faisal and his son, that it seems to me like this guy, like that's the perfect person in my mind, because he's older. He's an older statesman. He has a lot more wisdom. He has a lot more experience, and he has a lot more clout among like the region than maybe MBS does. And for him to come out and say that, I think is a very powerful thing, as opposed to maybe like the foreign minister who's Faisal bin Farhan or somebody else. So good question.
Yeah, it is interesting that Turki bin Faisal did get taken out of his position as director of Saudi intelligence on September 1st, 2011. 2001, September 1st.
Mm-hmm.
So like,
Yep.
Was it the case that he was not trusted to be in such a sensitive position, knowing what the Saudi intelligence was supposed to be doing during that whole operation? I don't know. It's a good question, but he's definitely been a consistent anomaly in the last 6 or so years. So that's very, very good points.
That's a great word too. I love anomalies. Like 2 years ago, every person I knew, like in like the truth movement, like whatever you want to call it, they all called Putin an anomaly. They're all like, he's an enigma. He's like they couldn't figure him out. I think we can all firmly say now that Putin, and I thought it at the time, but like even if I said it among my friends who were like informed, even they'd be like, oh, Putin's not a good guy. It's like, no, Putin is a good guy. Like, I think Putin is acting in earnest. I think he is actually trying to defeat this hegemony. And yeah, so I like enigmas. I like anomalies.
Yeah. Eva, Eva, are you still there? If you are still there, Eva, you might be on mute, which is why we cannot hear you. Okay, let's let Eva play around with her mic while we go to History Man. History Man, are you there, History Man? Okay, I'm guessing you wrote out your question, so you want me to read it. I'm presuming. Why are Iran and Saudi Arabia rolling out their own digital IDs, metaverse projects? Okay, I lost here. Metaverse project CBD sees Vision 2030s among other control mechanisms. So,
excellent question. So Vision 2030 is something that MBS came up with probably like earlier than this, but it really became a thing in 2015 when he became defense minister. That's when he started talking about it. He joined his father, came to the White House and met with Obama, and like as Hubbard explains in this book, really like caught the entire American administration off guard because this young kid, he was like 28 at the time. He comes in and he basically just talks down to Obama because Obama was sitting there chastising them for their culture, and he was like, with all due respect, you know nothing about us. Like, you don't really understand Arabian culture. You don't really understand Islam. I'd be happy to arrange like a tutor and to teach you, but you don't really know what you're talking about. So before you criticize us, maybe learn about our culture before you like completely blew everyone away because it was like so insulting to Obama. But that's when he was talking about Vision 2030. And then when he became crown prince, he comes back and talks about it again. And or before he became crown prince, because he didn't become crown prince until Trump entered office. But basically, as Hubbard explains, the entire Obama administration, the CIA, the State Department, they all wrote off Vision 2030 as a bunch of BS. They're like, this kid is just blowing smoke. He's not really doing any of this stuff. He's really running terrorist organizations. He's really being a ruthless warlord. Vision 2030 is the antithesis of Agenda 2030. If you don't know what Agenda 2030 is, Agenda 2030 is better known as the Great Reset. Everything you just described, digital IDs, the metaverse, DCs, control, like Orwellian 1984 control. That is the Great Reset. It was written by like the World Economic Forum, by those types. And the entire idea is like one world government, one global hegemony. Vision 2030 is the antithesis of that. It is destroy the global hegemony, regions of responsibility, a multipolar world, which is what Alexander Dugin, who's Putin's like political philosopher, he talks about that like every single day on Twitter X. Putin talks about that all the time. Xi talks about that in China. The regions of responsibility, what we at Badlands call the sovereign alliance, the idea that somebody else in the Middle East who is trustworthy is going to take care of the Middle East. We, America, Canada, Australia, don't need to be over there playing police. They're going to do it for us because it's in their best interest to make sure the Middle East is stable. So yes, as far as the other stuff goes, MBS is a huge tech geek. He's a big tech guy. And we talk about this a lot at Badlands. We have these discussions. Technology is one of those things. It's like a double-edged sword. It's a tool. A hammer in the right hands can be a great tool. You can build houses with it. You can build things with it. It can also be a weapon in somebody else's hands. You can murder somebody with a hammer. So anything can be something good or something bad. It just depends how you use it. I am not aware of any sort of CBDC, any sort of like digital currency, anything. I'm not aware of that happening in Saudi Arabia. I can't say about Iran. I don't know about Iran. Metaverse projects, if you're talking about like VR and stuff like virtual reality, MBS is way into all that stuff. He's into like the video game stuff. He's into the like interconnected interwebs. And by the way, Saudi Arabia, I think, has the number one social media usage, I believe, of any country in the world. So they are actually a very like tech centric population. 70% of their population is under the age of 30.
All right, that's cool. Yeah. Stephen Doyle.
Here I am.
Yeah,
Thanks. Gordon, loved it. What a great lecture. And so many questions I could ask. Like I could ask you to springboard from Las Vegas to Lahaina via the police chief connection, but I won't. I'll go back to your mention of Afghanistan, and I'll try to tie it into Saudi Arabia, UAE, and just get you to comment on an idea. From my read, I think one of the big strategic aims that's not been openly discussed about the pullout from Afghanistan was, I think it killed the CIA's heroin pipeline and all the hegemon funding that would have come from that. Now I'm looking at the BRICS nations, the talk about remonetizing gold or using gold as a trade settlement mechanism to supplant the US dollar. I know Saudi Arabia is moving towards BRICS membership. If I was looking at taking down the hegemon, I would see their financial system and the US dollar fiat currency system as a strategic center of gravity, for lack of a better term. Do you have any read from your view of the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, that there is some sort of broader multipolar effort to undermine the hegemon financially, the financial system, the US dollar, all that sort of stuff?
Yes, absolutely. It's a really, really good question. Joe Lang is a writer for Badlands. He has a article called Master and Commander. If you just go to Google and look up Badlands Substack, Joe Lang, that's Lange, Master and Commander. It's a series, but that's the first one. He writes about all of this, and he does it very, very well. And that's like his wheelhouse is the takedown of the fiat dollar, because what you're describing is the fiat dollar. And that's really the interesting thing here, is that Kissinger put really like the power or the control of the US dollar, petrodollar, in the hands of the House of Saud. And now it, like MBS, just through this like sequence of circumstances, is now in control. Like he could destroy the value of the US dollar tomorrow, really, if he wanted to, if he pulled the right strings. And the fact that Saudi Arabia has joined BRICS, which effectively took effect on January 1st of this year with Iran. They were 11 nations were supposed to join. Argentina backed out at the last minute. But the other 10 countries that joined, Iran and Saudi Arabia were one of them. I think there's a lot to say about that. They also discovered, this is kind of like an interesting aside, they discovered a major gold deposit in Saudi Arabia last month, and they have assessed its value, and it's 1.4 trillion, something like that. And they found this huge gold deposit. I don't know what that means. I don't know enough about financial markets and gold and everything to know how that impacts the gold market or whatever. There are people who are way into Bitcoin. I know people who are really into Bitcoin. They think that's the future, and that, blockchain, that could be the case. I think gold is probably going to play a role. The one thing that I know for certain is that the fiat dollar has to go. It's the crux. It's the lifeblood of the global hegemony. It's how they are able to launder and steal all of our money. It's how they are able to keep all these proxy militias funded. Is because they're able just to print money without asking our permission, just print money and then send it off and launder it through different organizations. So the US dollar has to go. I do believe that everything we're watching right now is part of that operation, like a coordinated strategic idea plan that Donald Trump's a part of, that Mohammed bin Salman's a part of, that Putin and Xi are a part of. Yeah, and it has to be done in a very careful way to make sure that you don't create a catastrophe that results in, civil war here at home.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jerry, go for it.
I have the kids coming downstairs, so I probably only have a few more minutes before I'm going to get.
All right, so let's do a quick one with Jerry, and then yep. Dave has a very, very short one afterwards on Kanye cities. So yeah, Jerry, go for it.
Okay, I'll try to be short. Thanks, Gordon. I'm another big fan of you and Matt on Breaking History.
Thank you.
And the one you did a couple of weeks ago on Saudi Arabia and MBS and the Abraham Accords, I thought that was really good. And anyone listening who hasn't listened to that should go back and listen to it because it was great. But I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia and Iran, because I've really been interested in this since they kind of got back together with the help of China. And for me, if you just look on a map and you see Saudi Arabia and you see Iran, and in between is Iraq. And I think that's the key to the whole thing. And I know Iraq is, I don't understand it today. It's a mess. They have lots of problems. I mean, goes back to the invasion of Iraq, or even before that, to the 80s, the Iran and Iraq war, where the U.S. was backing Saddam Hussein. They were backing Iraq. But I just think that you'd mentioned there's talk about the U.S. pulling troops out of Syria and also out of Iraq. And I know the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution calling for all foreign troops to leave. And I think if anything can straighten out that mess, it would be there. But I'm wondering, do you see something positive happening with Iraq because of this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Or do you think it's going to be used for some nefarious operation run out of the deep state again?
Well, it's a really good question. I actually think the problems with Iraq go back to World War I and the way that the boundary lines were drawn. That was actually a country that was supposed to be run by the Hashemites, and it was for a few years. But yes, the fact that they created this country that had both Sunni, Shia, Arabs, Persians, Kurds, like a large part of Iraq, like northern Iraq, is all Kurdish. The Kurds were completely disregarded when they were drawing up the national boundary lines. So you have a big Kurdish population in eastern Turkey, a big Kurdish, half of Syria is Kurdish, and then you have northern Iraq are Kurds, and even like the very western portions of Iran, they didn't get their own country, and those are the people that typically are used as like the proxy militias to start these wars. So I think that I do think that the entire region is going to prosper. I think MBS's plan is for the entire region, basically for them to go through a renaissance and for the entire Middle East to experience like a European type renaissance where the rising tide raises all ships and everyone's going to benefit from it. I think it's going to be very confusing and convoluted up until like that moment where everything just kind of clicks and everything makes sense. But yeah, I think I'm being driven off. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question. That Iraq is I think Iraq's going to be okay.
Yeah,
I think Iraq is going to be okay. So
yeah, there's definitely something very, very historic and that's sweeping across the world right now. And definitely there's a lot to hold on to. There's a lot of reason for reasonable hope. And Gordon, I think you've just gone through a really wonderful foundation building presentation. You've opened up a lot of doors for questions. We see that you have other fans that are pulling you in another direction. So thank you so much for taking the time very generously today, and thank you everyone for showing up for this the Sunday afternoon session. And we'll join back next week. Is there any final thoughts you wanted to throw out there, Gordon?
No, I sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if you want to like email them to me or send them to me, Matt, if you want to gather them up, I'm happy. We can address them like on Wednesday's show, on Breaking History or whatever. So thank you for having me. Appreciate everyone's kind words, and thanks for watching.
Great. All right. Bye, everybody.
So much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.